Audio Janda. Audio Janda.
Welcome to the 2008 when I was 24 years old and already a seasoned investor with 8 years of real trading behind me, that a friend showed me how this institution works. But G. Edward Griffin's book is like the manual for understanding the creation of the Fed, and he joins us today for a special interview, and I'm sure we'll cover many critical topics. Mr. Griffin is a writer, he's a documentary film producer, founder of Freedom Force International, and that's his website, freedomforceinternational.com. Obviously, he's the man behind the masterpiece, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Welcome to the show. How are you today, Ed?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for that very kind introduction.
Hey, we're doing this interview in such a critical time for all economies, and I want to ask you, Mr. Griffin, are all central banks counterproductive to their respective economies, no matter how they're built and formed? If so, if they're just bad ideas financially, why are they still around and why are they so popular?
Wow, that last part is the tough one, of course. The first part is easy. The answer is that yes, all central banks are counterproductive to an efficient economy and a lot more. Because we have to understand what they are. When we say a central bank, what is that? You have to go to the encyclopedia, and after you've read it, you still don't know what it means. So if we understand that a central bank is nothing more or less than a banking cartel, no different than an oil cartel or a banana cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. And not only that, but it has gone into partnership with the government where it resides. And the government, in return for a lot of economic favors, has given it a monopoly over the money supply. So you have a private banking cartel that it controls the money supply of the nation. Now, if that isn't a formula for bad news, I don't know what it is, because, as Lord Rothschild is said to have, he's quoted often as saying this, although I can't find the source of it, but I'm sure he did say it. He said, "I care not who makes the laws so long as I make the money."
Sure. Now, just to understand something, all central banks are not private. There are many central banks that are government-owned or government creations, but you're specifically more referring to the Federal Reserve, correct?
I was referring to the Federal Reserve, yes, because that is officially private. But even in the other countries in which they are allegedly, government agencies, if you examine them carefully, you find that the real influence comes from the very private sector. Even in the United States, we say, well, we got the United States here and the corporations over there, but you'll notice that when the corporations speak, the politicians say yes, sir. So there's the appearance, and then there's the reality, and the reality in all cases is that the system is very, very private, and the public has very little, if any, input.
Well, definitely, if you're talking about the back and forth between politics and elite financial institutions, that goes on in every country since the dawn of time. I want to talk to you about the inception of the Fed. So many presidents have fought to keep any central bank from forming in the U.S. What brought about the change and made things more flexible on the political landscape so that the public and the Congress accepted central banks in 1913? What brought that about? What happened in the years prior that created an environment where the president could be made an accomplice to this? And it just, tell us about that era.
Well, yeah, I think we have to go back a little further than that, because the question you raised is a really good one. What happened to the people? What happened to their awareness? Why did they allow this to happen? And it's like so many things with the passage of time. The old folks die off, and the young ones come along, and that next generation doesn't know a big chunk of the history. And then they grow older, and they pass along, and the third generation comes along. By the time you get to the fourth and fifth generation, there's practically no real living memory of the issues and the conflicts, the emotions that led to some very important decisions. And then especially if you have a group of people, as we do in the world today, who are interested in putting a lot of that history into the memory hole, so that it's not even available in print hardly anymore. So the people, by the time 1913 came along, had no living memory of the tragedies and the problems and the conflicts and the suffering, literally, that came as a result of central banking in the time of their fathers and their grandfathers and so forth. So that's the general answer. But then now you get right to the scene, and there was a lot of very brilliant public relations work going on the part of the banks. You know, these fellows are not dumb. They're brilliant, and they're not just monetary scientists, if you want to call it that. They understand money at a much deeper level than most people. Certainly, they understand it better than most politicians. But not only that, they're political engineers. They understand that you can't just work in a vacuum, especially in the modern day where communication is so efficient, and the people have been conditioned to the idea that they are, somehow that they are masters of their own political destiny because they have a vote. So you always have to keep the people content, thinking that whatever's happening out there, that it's their decision, and that, of course, is ridiculous when you really understand how things work. But part of it is part of the psychology of making anything big happen in politics and in society in general is you have to convince the people that it's their will, that this is really coming from the majority. And so no matter how much you may not like it, you have to say, oh, well, I guess it's just me. Everybody else wants this, and so this is a democracy, right? And, that kind of thinking. So I guess the world is crazy, and I just have to go along with it because that's what the people want. Well, these guys that sold the Federal Reserve System to the American people had to create that kind of an attitude on the part of the people in general, that this is something that was good, was something that everybody wanted. And so there was a public relations campaign that went on, funded by the the people who would become the central bankers. And they donated money to a lot of the universities in America. The universities were all hungry for money in those days. It wasn't so funded like it is today from the government. So the banks came along and gave big chunks of money to some of the universities. And in return, of course, they asked for a favor, which would be to have a voice in selecting the head of the economics department for the university. Of course, that would be somebody from the banking ranks. And so it didn't take very long before academia was, or at least a few very well-chosen people in academia, were writing these papers saying how wonderful the future, what we now call the Federal Reserve System, would be if it were passed into law, how it would control the big bad bankers, And some of the bankers themselves were giving speeches, high-profile public speeches that they knew would get into the newspapers, where they were criticizing their own plan. Don't forget, this Federal Reserve System was actually drafted by the bankers themselves at a highly secret meeting in Jekyll Island back in 1910, 3 years before it was passed into law. But they didn't want anybody to know that they were the authors of this legislation, because the law was supposed to control the banks. So had the public known that the banks wrote the law, it would have been, of course, the cat would have been out of the bag. So anyway, they had to convince the public that this was a good thing, and the bankers were giving speeches saying, this law is going to be bad for America, it's going to be bad for the economy. The average gum-chewing person in the public would say, hey, Maud, listen to this. The Federal Reserve System they're talking about, well, the bankers don't like it. It must be good. So this is actually what was going on There was a lot of, I call it public relations, maybe a better word is propaganda. And so the people and the congressmen were sold a bill of goods by a highly professionally operated public relations campaign. So their attitudes were literally engineered by the bankers who wanted to pass their own law, their own cartel agreement, I should call it, pass it into law, so that now the whole nation has to live by the rules of the cartel agreement. And that's what we have today.
Now, were there always warnings from people about the Fed and about what will happen to America? Is this fight between the different schools of economics, does this go back to 1913? I mean, did people rise up back then and say, hey, this is ridiculous, why are we giving it the power of creation of currency to them? Why are we letting a central bank operate in America? Or is this more of a recent phenomenon?
No, there were always people along the line, some very, very well-educated people, some knowledgeable people. And there were some very honest bankers in those days, too. Not all bankers were in favor of this. There were always voices of warning. But, it's like everything else. Unfortunately, the wheel that squeaks gets the grease, and the louder the voice gets the most attention. And so the side which has the money that can afford to have a higher wattage amplifier, and in other words, what I'm trying to say, forget the allegories, what I'm trying to say is if you have influence over the press and over the media and over the educational institutions, your voice is very, very loud, and it's highly respected. So it's this voice of authority that if you can command the voice of authority, whatever that is, means to different things to different people, why, then the masses will just follow it. So there are always minor voices that are not as loud, that have been trying to warn about this, as there are today. However, today I think some of our voices of warning are getting louder and louder, mainly because we have been able to use some of the modern technology to make an end run around the monopoly of the mainstream media. It used to be if you couldn't get on NBC or CBS or something like that, you were never heard. And now the internet and alternative radio programs like this one, for example, are giving us an opportunity to get the message out. So we're going into a new phase now, and I'm very hopeful because of that.
I've read in numerous books a list of banks that are supposedly the shareholders of the central bank of the Federal Reserve. Some of them are the Warburg banks of Germany and the Netherlands, and you got some Rothschild Bank in there, and Lazard of Paris. Is this an accurate list? What are your findings on who actually has the bonds or the shareholders of the Federal Reserve? How is it owned?
That's really a good question. I'll take your first question first. Do I know who owns the Fed in that sense, like these secret bonds or this second class of stock ownership? The answer is no. I've never seen a list, and I don't think anybody has. If they have, they haven't photocopied it and published it. And so when you see these names of the Rothschilds and the Lazars and so forth, I'm very interested in it. I see them a lot. It's quoted a lot. But I've never been able to run it down to an original document where I could say, yep, that's true, and here I've got a copy of it, and here's a person who was living at the time, wrote about it in this book, and so forth. I've never seen that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not real. And even if they don't own the bonds, so to speak, they don't have the stock certificates in their vault, that doesn't mean they can't control something. Because in this age, control comes with influence. It comes with the power of being able to make decisions, and people respect the person that holds that power. For example, a king, he doesn't actually carry any weapons around, but when he says, that he wants an army to move, the army moves. So people respect the king. Well, there are kings in that sense, financial kings in our banking world, and when they direct an army to move, a financial army, it moves. So the influence is there, whether it's officially in a stock certificate or a bond or something. It's definitely there, and I think that's the important part. And now, technically, you can say who owns the Fed. That's a matter of record. The Fed technically is owned by all of the member banks. They all hold a piece of stock. It looks like regular common stock, but it doesn't. It's a kind of a, I was going to say fraud. It's not really a fraud, but it's a hybrid. It looks like a regular piece of stock, but it's not, because it doesn't carry the privilege of stock ownership. If you own a piece of stock in a corporation, you can vote for the board of directors. And of course, the banks hold their certificates and they cannot vote for the board of directors. If you own a piece of stock, it's yours, you can sell it. Well, the banks own their stock, but they can't sell it. So in other words, the two of the most critical aspects of private ownership of stock are missing. So it's not really a piece of stock as we think of it at all. It's kind of like window dressing. And it simply is a certificate that says Bank of Baltimore or something, you hereby have put in a few bucks and you are now a member of the Federal Reserve System, and da-da-da. So it's kind of for window dressing. The real power of the Federal Reserve is held in the hands of the directors of the biggest banks. It's the old story of, the biggest gorilla in the group controls the whole group.
Sure. Now, let me ask you this. This is just your opinion, but how much was the Fed involved, in your opinion, in Nixon's decision to cut the gold window back in '71 and go on a dollar debt standard?
Well, I would say that the Fed was probably the most dominant force in that decision. But as long as I can qualify and say the Fed, don't forget, is a it's a monopoly. It's a cartel. When you talk about the Fed, you have to say, well, who? It's people. These were the boards of directors of the largest banks in America made that decision. They put the pressure on them. And of course, they all happened to be members of the Fed. Well, not the board of directors, but I mean, they controlled it. The Federal Reserve System is a cartel. So we have to keep thinking always that it's not this great institution that we think. It's like saying, well, supposing the oil cartel made a decision to increase the price of oil tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Well, who made the decision? The oil cartel. What is that? Is that a piece of paper? No, it's people. So when you go back to the question of who put the pressure on Nixon, it would certainly be people who were highly in position within the Federal Reserve System, but some of them may not have even been there at all, but they all had a common interest in this economic matrix of getting the dollar broken away from gold. Because you see, as long as any monetary system is linked to gold or silver or anything else which has limited quantity, well, then that means that the quantity of money is limited also. Well, this is good for the average person because it means that the purchasing power of that money will be stable. A person who's using money doesn't want the money supply to be expanding underneath his feet and made out of thin air by banks, because that means it devalues each unit. And so he needs more and more and more of it to buy the things that he needs every day. So users and citizens are very ill-served by the ability to expand the money supply. Limited money supply, on the other hand, is horrible to the banks, because the money supply is how they make money. They make money by lending money. So if their inventory of money is limited, they can't charge interest on that which they don't have. However, if you can create money out of nothing, as the banks indeed do, and then collect interest on that, now you've got a pretty good deal. You're actually collecting interest on nothing. This is why banks hate the idea of a monetary system that's backed by gold or silver or anything else which absolutely limits the amount of their inventory, because it cuts deeply into their ability to make a profit. So that's why they wanted Nixon to break the dollar away from gold. Primarily, of course, the other countries we all know were making demands on the gold, and it would have been very embarrassing when the gold supply ran out and Uncle Sam had to say, oh yeah, we promised to pay you, but we don't have it anymore. So there was that element also.
Ed, I want to ask you, obviously this is a question of opinion, but how much longer do you see the dollar acting as reserve currency?
Well, I'm very bad at dates. I've always thought that the chickens would come home to roost much sooner than they actually did. So I'm always expecting these results, these negative results, to happen sooner. So I'm not going to give a date. All I can say is that it's overdue. It's I don't know how much longer they can keep this bubble going, but I do know they won't be.
Proper replacement also. I don't think there's something that can truly replace the dollar on a technical basis. It's so flooded around the world, and all transactions are reliant upon it so much. It's very there needs to be a backup plan before we can get rid of it.
Well, it will be phased out. There's no question about that. It's just a question of when, and that was your question, is when. And I appreciated that component of the question because it indicates you recognize that this can't go on forever. I think any grade school child should be able to figure that out too. You can't keep pumping air into a balloon forever. Sooner or later, it's going to pop. It's just that we don't know when.
Now, can you see cryptocurrencies as having, or some of them, or one of them, or a way that they, or the blockchain technology, have a role in a future monetary system, even if it's backed by gold, even if it's not backed by precious metal, whatever is coming next? Can the cryptographic layer upon currencies, can the fact that you can engineer it so that there are only a limited amount of a certain currency, this layer of privacy, the speed, the fact that it's 24/7, all these attributes that we found out this technology has, can these be part of the newly formed currencies that we'll use in the future to transact? Because obviously the world is going to transact, currencies are going to exist, whether backed by gold or not. Hopefully yes, but is the blockchain the future of how we do transactions?
Yes and no, because your question had two parts. You're talking at one point about currency and the next part about transactions. Now, currency is used for transactions, of course, but when most people use the word currency, they're thinking of money. And now money is not necessarily currency. So now we get into that part. But let me back away from all that complexity and just say that there's no question in my mind that the blockchain technology will play a significant role in future economic transactions because it's efficient. It has the potential, at least, for providing privacy and all of the good qualities that we discuss. I don't think it will, unless there's something that comes along that I can't envision, and that won't be the first time that happened, but unless something really startling comes along, I don't see how it'll play a role in money as a storehouse of value. And let me clarify that. I think that, for example, you mentioned that you can put a limit on the amount of units that can be created in a currency like Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency. And that is well and good, but then the minute you reach the capacity of that currency, somebody will come along with another one, and there'll be Bitcoin B. Well, so
obviously you need to regulate whoever is legal, and obviously you can't have it like it is now, that there are over 1,000 of them, and if Bitcoin has 21 million, what does that have anything to do with the fact that I can open another one? And
yeah, exactly.
But overall, is this technology, in your opinion, powerful enough, sophisticated enough, and has advantages over fiat currencies that this is where the world is moving to?
Well, it has a lot of powerful advantages over fiat currency that's created by governments. There's no question about it, because I think the least trustworthy segment of the population is politicians. So anybody that's got the idea that they're going to turn their monetary system and all the regulation thereof over to the predator class is, I think, not very realistic. So I think that the blockchain technology is going to play a role and should play a role in making financial transactions. But I'm one category, and that is intrinsic value. And that is always one of the most important elements of a historically sound monetary system, is that in addition to all the other things that we know about, it's fungible and it's, all those things, but it should have, the most efficient ones should have and do have intrinsic value, which means that these things can be used for something else even if they're not used for money. That's the reason gold and silver have been always chosen. So when the power goes out, where's your cryptocurrency? It's gone. It disappears. It's vaporware. It doesn't have intrinsic value. Its only value is for commercial exchanges, which is not to say it hasn't a function, but it does say, in my mind at least, that cryptocurrencies should play a big role in actually making transactions because of the privacy, the speed, the efficiency, and all of those good things. But once the transaction is made, a person would be silly to put their savings into that. Once you have more than what you need just for your daily or monthly transactions, you should pull it out and put it into something that has intrinsic value, so that when everything goes out, the lights go out, you still your food or whatever it is,
Sure, obviously cryptocurrencies are currencies and they aren't money, and that's an important distinction. I want to ask you about what's next in terms of rate hikes. We've seen 3 rate hikes in this tightening cycle that started December 2015. We're approaching on December 2017, 2 years later. Tops for the stock market since 1971 have coincided with about 2 years after a tightening cycle has begun and about the 4th rate hike. Do you see the market topping, the stock market topping, around the same time as the Fed raises rates again for the 4th time? And how much do you think they can raise rates in this environment? This is not 1979. This is not the 90s. This is not the 2000s. America is still the largest economy in the world, but it's based on insane amounts of debts, very politically divergent. That there are other candidates to be the superpower, which weren't around 20 or 30 years ago. I'm talking about China, of course. And it's just not possible for the U.S. to maneuver and be flexible like before. So what's next for rate hikes?
Good question. You got some good questions there. The obvious answer is I don't know, but you did ask me my opinion, and I'm not so sure I even know what that is, because I can see 2 scenarios that both make sense to me. If you just look at it from the strictly economic scenario, say, how is this going to work, and how is it going to be beneficial for the economy or for a certain group of people, then you'd say, well, these rate hikes cannot continue because they're going to stagnate or weaken the economy, or maybe be the pinprick that bursts that bubble we've been talking about. So if you look at it from the point of view, well, how can we do something to be the best move for the economy, then we would say, well, they got to back off of those interest rates. But if we have a more conspiratorial view and say, well, supposing the bankers don't like the present administration and they want to topple Mr. Trump, wouldn't it be an easy thing to do is to deliberately cause an economic crisis and say, look what that guy Trump did? These guys do that kind of thing. Historically, we know that's the way they play the game. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think we ought to have our eyes open. And no matter what happens, we have to realize that this is not the free market anymore. This is not capitalism. This is complete crony socialism or collectivism. The markets are rigged. The interest rates are rigged. These guys are running the show. So no matter what happens, there are people who say, oh, it's capitalism, and look what it did. It crashed. It doesn't work. We haven't had unfettered capitalism in America for almost 100 years. So all of these things come to mind when you ask that question, and it's what makes it so tough.
Interesting. I want to ask you lastly, what's, for people listening, and you want to leave them off with a big event or a big thing that they need to watch in the coming weeks and months, what are some of the things that investors must watch?
Oh, wow. I'm totally ill-prepared and unqualified to answer that question. I think that investors, the implication of the question is investors, if they're smart enough, can figure out how to maneuver within this system and do okay. Otherwise, why do we care? What are we going to watch for? What are we going to do? How are we going to? So, and that's the thing that I have trouble with, because I think the system is under such stress that there's no way in the world that you can benefit in any way. Maybe in the short run, yes, but the system is going down, folks. And nobody's going to come out of this very well if we don't restore the free enterprise system. So if you're looking for a formula, well, if we do this on the 4th of next month or something, and then watch for the peak on such and such a date, and project a chart on it and so forth, and historically we know that the market will dip on the 15th, all that stuff, it doesn't work anymore in my view. And maybe it does a little bit, but even if it did, I think we should be focusing on how to restore the system, how to educate our fellow Americans as to what needs to be done, get the government off the back of the economy, and get these cartelists get their hands out of our pockets and off of our money supply. That's where we have to really be working.
Well, sure, and that's exactly what we're doing right here, right now. We're educating and making sure that as many people that are interested are hearing what you have to say. G. Edward Griffin, can you tell people your website, what are you doing today, how can people get in touch, and basically plug that information for us?
Oh, yeah, well, I'm glad we have another hour for that. Just kidding. Oh, yeah, I usually forget to talk about those things, but thanks for reminding me. My staff is always saying, and Mr. G, you didn't talk about where people can come to your site. Yep, that's true. So, thanks. Okay, we'll start with our commercial site, which is realityzone.com. That's where we have books and recordings. We've got about 100 of those that are on topics like this. Only even, much broader than just the economy, things that I think that are very important for the return of the system that I mentioned a moment ago. And you'll find them all there, including my books, but many more than that, at realityzone.com. And then we have a think tank group that I created back in 2002 called freedomforceinternational.org. And we have nothing to sell there but ideas and strategies and plans of how to get organized and to form coalitions with each other in many countries around the world, as well as here in the United States. And what we do after we get together, what do we believe in? What are we trying to create? Who is the enemy? Is it socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, or is it collectivism, and all these issues that need to be thought through? And so for the serious person that wants to really grapple with a solution, I urge you, please come to freedomforceinternational.org. And you'll find it all there. And then finally, the last thing would be, if you're interested in what I'm up to, I put out a daily news service called needtoknow.news. So just remember that, needtoknow.news. Come on, it's a free subscription, and I give my daily analysis of what's going on in the world and bring in a lot of other experts as well.
G. Edward Griffin, what a privilege to have you on. And we'll definitely have you on again if you're willing to do it. And thank you very much for taking the time here.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Goodbye.
Thanks for taking the time to tune in today. G. Edward Griffin is responsible and the man behind many important books and documentaries Today we spoke to him about his forte, his expertise, the Federal Reserve System, and what I'd like to point out is that it's like G. Edward Griffin said, it was designed by human beings just like us, who are forwarding their own agendas. But just like any man-made system, it's not perfect. Not at all. And instead of complaining over its inherent challenges, what people should do, and we're talking about the financially educated people, I want you to embrace the fact that you are prepared to handle what the Federal Reserve has created, all of these problems, all of this debt. I wish for you to act on it and not become a victim of it. Go to wealthresearchgroup.com/gold playbook, and you'll find the most comprehensive manual on how to look at junior mining stocks which will flourish in this coming cycle. And go to wealthresearchgroup.com/special-reports, where you'll find a wide array of top-notch PDF downloads in order to prepare your financial fortress and your family for the future. There will be no government bailout which can save the people who do not take action of their own. Plain and simple. Fed or not, it's up to you to make the intelligent decisions every day and position correctly for what's coming. Go to wealthresearchgroup.com/blueprint for my detailed crash blueprint and how to act in advance of what's coming. We've got amazing interviews lined up for you. Stay updated with the channel and the free newsletter.